Part 6. Well, well, well. What have we got here? Sylvie said as Valden walked through the crowd towards her. Thought you'd seen the last of me, Well, I'm sorry, but it's over for you, baby brother. I'm taking you straight home, and then I'll think of something to make you pay for disobeying me. I'm not your baby brother, Valden replied. He was standing just outside her grabbing distance, and he was seriously considered just making a run for it. And damn the consequences. And I'm not going back. Not unless I want to. You think that because you're bigger than me that you get to boss me around? Duh, of course I get to boss you around. You're nothing but a little bug compared to me, and it's time you accepted that. You'll always be my baby brother, and I'll always get to do what I want to you. Now, unless you think your new friends here can help you, I suggest you give yourself up to me now. Valden looked around him in despondency. The crowd of villagers had their eyes fixed on him. Many, most of them in fact, had looks of sympathy for him, but he could tell that they were all scared of Sylvie, and therefore hesitant to step in and help him. His spirits sinking even further, he turned back and faced his sister, when suddenly he felt a small hand grab his own. He looked down and saw Nut tugging on his arm. Don't go, the boy said. Don't go with her, Valden. She can't make you go. Come with Red and me. We'll protect you. Then, turning to Sylvie, he yelled, He's not going with you, you big beast. You're going to have to deal with me first. Valden looked up and saw Sylvie gazing at him in amusement. Nut kept yanking on his arm while his brother stood uneasily by his side. That's very cute, baby brother, but it's time to go now. Come on. Sylvie reached down to grab him, but Valden and Nut made a dash for it and disappeared off into the crowd. At the same time, Rhett grabbed a spear from a nearby hunter, and with all of his strength, threw it up at Sylvie's face. It hit her in the face and actually stuck fast, and she yelped. Quickly, this way, Nut yelled, with Valden running behind him. In here, we can hide in the basement. They went into a decent-sized nearby house, and Nut closed the door behind him. Then he made for a wooden trap door in the floor, Valden following, and they both went to hide in a little underground room, hoping Sylvie's giant hands wouldn't fit in here. Sylvie, meanwhile, pulled the spear out of her cheek and threw it away. She looked down and was annoyed to see that several of the other villagers had also raised their spears, ready to throw them if she came closer. Others had drawn their bows, and a few were brandishing tiny swords and axes. Oh, please. Do you really think you can hurt me, you tiny little ants? That was just a lucky hit. And it didn't hurt me one bit. Now stand aside or I'll crush you. No, Rhett called out loudly, not budging even an inch. Several of the older warriors, the chief included, were inspired by the boy's courage, and they stood their ground as well. Even after Sylvie rose to her full height and held her foot above them, threatening to bring it down on them. But they didn't flee. Fine, Sylvie shouted, thoroughly exasperated but also a bit humiliated. She felt almost tempted to carry out on her threats. But she just couldn't do it. Killing people was wrong, she knew that. And the thought of actually stepping on someone, even someone she didn't like one bit, made her feel horrible inside. I'll just have to step over them, she thought. Stretching her legs as far as they could go, she passed over the crowd with one giant pace. Heading straight for the house into which Valden disappeared, and she began calling for her brother, using the same threat she told the villagers earlier. This isn't funny anymore, Valden, she pleaded. Please come out now, you're being an idiot. She tried squeezing her hand into the doorway, and only succeeded in breaking the door off its hinges. Her wrist was too thick to fit properly, and when she tried to pull her hand back out, she found her arm was stuck. She yanked her hand back, and a large section of the wall disintegrated into rubble. Now angry beyond words, she stood up and placed her boot on top of the house's roof. Valden, if you don't come out right now, I'll kick the house down, and then you'll be sorry. She lowered her foot and the roof began to creak and groan. But Valden still stayed in hiding. And Sylvie, not knowing whether or not there were other people inside the house, stopped trying to knock it down. Feeling quite miserable and even more humiliated than earlier, she tried one last time to coax Valden out. She got down on her knees and put her hand in the hole where she made, trying to find any opening in which he might be hiding. "Please, Valden," she cried. "I'm really sorry. Now please come. You know I can't go back without you. Mom and Dad will be so angry. They'll punish me, Valden. If I don't bring you back safely, they'll punish you too. Mommy will come all the way here and drag you out, and then she'll make you pay for being such a baby." But there was still no response from her brother, and she felt small tears of despair forming in the corners of her eyes. How could he have outwitted her, she thought bitterly. How could he just go and do whatever he wanted to, without caring about how it would make her feel? "He's not coming out," the chief said, bravely advancing towards her. "Go home, girl. We don't want you here. You clearly don't have the stomach for fighting, but we do, and we'll fight you if we have to." "Yes, go," another warrior said, and soon all the men were shouting it at her, waving their weapons in defiance. They realized how completely empty her threats were, and that she didn't have it in her to actually crush them or their houses. But the giantess, enraged as she was still a daunting, if not terrifying, adversary. "Fine," Sylvie screamed, her eyes pouring tears. "But I'll come back, and then I'll... Ah!" With a cry of rage, she kicked her boots against the house Valden was hiding in. It collapsed into 1,000 pieces of debris, some of which flew off across the trees of the forest. Then, without another word, she ran off into the forest, and they could hear her crying even after she'd vanished from sight. Once it was clear that she wasn't coming back, the men began to search among the rubble of the house. Thankfully, no one had been inside when Sylvie smashed it, and they merely had to clear a few stone blocks away to open the trap door leading to the cellar. A very grateful Valden emerged, and he immediately promised to help repair the house, and do everything else he could to repay Grun and his folk for their kindness, and for refusing to give in to his sister's demands. Meanwhile, Sylvie was storming through the forest, knocking over trees indiscriminately, not even bothering to look at the ground to make sure she didn't step on anyone. Over and over, she kept telling herself how nasty and mean those people were, and how much she hated them, and especially how much of a selfish, sniveling little bastard her brother was. She reached the river she'd crossed earlier, and saw a row of fishing boats moored alongside its shore. With cries of anger, she smashed the lot of them under her boots, except for the biggest one. This boat she snatched and threw across the river. It hit the top of a cliff on the opposite side and broke apart. "I hate you!" she screamed back in the direction of the village. "Do you hear me, Valden? You and the rest can just go and die!" Then she sat down in the snow and began to cry anew. By the time she finally stopped crying, it was late afternoon, and she was starting to feel unbearably hungry. There was nothing to eat here, so she jumped across the river and began to look in her pack. It took her an hour to find, and she tucked into a loaf of bread voraciously. Afterwards, she felt a bit better, but not much. She imagined Valden eating a hearty dinner in a warm dining room, and the thought made her sick. It almost drove her to go back and apologize and beg the villagers for some more food, and perhaps a warm place to sleep. But she felt too ashamed to do that. And the more she thought about what happened today, the more she regretted her actions. "I shouldn't have been so rude," she thought, getting a fire started from a few large logs. "Belina would never have done what I did. I guess that's why Valden likes her more than me. But it's still his fault. I'll get him back, no matter how long it takes. But if I go back now without him, Mommy would really kill me. I'm so tired and thirsty." She got up and filled her water flask at the river, then lay down and prepared for a long, cold night. She wondered where Valden was sleeping tonight, then decided that she didn't really care. If she had been just a bit stronger-willed, she would have get up by now and solved this mess she made. But she was just a spoiled, obnoxious, faint-hearted little girl, she thought ashamedly. And she didn't have the first idea of what she should do. She even began to doubt if she and Valden would ever speak to each other again. Maybe he'll come to me, she wondered, her eyes heavily from encroaching sleep. Maybe tomorrow morning. He'll be right here. And we can talk. Work things out. And go home. Sylvie couldn't believe her eyes when she realized what she had discovered. She'd been camping out in the forest for almost a week and was on the verge of abandoning Valden to his fate and going back to her home. Every day seemed colder and more unpleasant than the one before, and the supplies she brought along were running very low. Also, she hadn't had a bath in ages, which made her present discovery the most welcome sight she'd ever seen since leaving Valden. Tucked away between the high peaks of the mountains was a large pool, almost like a lake, fed by a hot water spring. Clouds of steam were rising from its calm surface, and Sylvie could only imagine how nice it must feel to lie down in the water. Taking a quick glance around to make sure she was alone, she began to undress. Soon she was standing naked and shivering in the snow, but once she climbed over the rocks and into the pool, she felt pure, unbridled bliss. It's wonderful, she said aloud. I can warm up and get clean at the same time, and there's no one here to hurry me along. The pool was just deep enough to cover her body completely while lying down, and the water, while uncomfortably hot by human standards, was just right for hers. She rolled around soaking her hair in the pure water, and generally just enjoyed herself for the first time in what seemed like forever. Eventually she decided to finish her bath, so she reluctantly climbed out. Not having brought any towel, she simply lay down on a large, warm, flat rock by the pool's edge and let the sun dry her. I'm getting thinner, she thought, running her hands across her naked chest and waist. No wonder. I haven't had something decent to eat since leaving home. Oh well, at least I'll be able to do that when I get back. Valden can stay here and eat raw fish and tree bark, see if I care. She went and fetched her clothes, wincing as the cold air of the mountains hit her once again, and hurriedly got dressed. Once more in her, by now quite dirty garments, she went off to find some wild animal for dinner, having firmly decided that tonight's camping site would be right next to the hot spring, and that tomorrow she would begin her journey back home. All of a sudden, she heard what sounded like a hoarse roar coming from somewhere above her. She looked up, but could only see the mountain's steep, rocky cliffs towering above her. Then she heard it again, and this time she did see something. What looked like a large, fast-flying bird was flying down from the mountainside, almost touching the cliffs. But as it drew closer and closer, it appeared larger and larger. Sylvie soon realized it was no bird. She watched the beast curiously until she saw that it was heading straight towards her, and that it was almost as big as she was. She ducked down in fright, and the enormous winged reptile flew overhead without pausing. Sylvie caught a quick glimpse, but she knew what type of creature it was. A dragon. Or something very much like a dragon. Whoa! It's big, she thought, as the monster flew down into the valley. Thank goodness it didn't attack me. But I wonder where it's going. There's nothing down there except... Oh no. It must be heading towards the village. She got up at once, began making her way down the mountainside, but then stopped and reconsidered. Why should I go help them? They've been nothing but mean to me, and it's their fault if they decide to live near a dragon's den. Besides, they were all boasting about what great warriors they were, and Valden was always on and on about how he wasn't afraid of anything. They don't deserve my help, and that's that. That dragon thing is too big for me to kill anyway. So she headed back. But once more her conscience made her uneasy. She remembered when many, many years ago, her mother, the queen, had risked her own life to fight off a giant-sized wolf that was attacking the villages of Vandan. Sure, Queen Valerie had been armed with a bow and arrows, and was wearing protective armor. But what she did was still very dangerous, and she hadn't for a moment thought about leaving the little humans to their fate. And if Sylvie went home, and her mother found out that she'd left her brother and an entire village at the mercy of a ravenous dragon... Why does it have to be me? She said to herself. Of course I can't leave them alone. They wouldn't stand a chance. And their children, and little girls, and babies too. I can't let them be eaten. But what can I do? I'm not a warrior, and I've only got this little dagger. She drew it from its sheath and once more set off in pursuit of the winged beast. Every step she took made her more afraid, but she couldn't turn back. She was going to prove to everyone, Valden included, that she was a princess of Vandan, in deed as well as in blood. If anyone had any hope of slaying that monster, it was her, little Sylvie. But if she could somehow succeed, then Valden will have to respect me, and he will come back with me, and no one will ever treat me like a child again. Valden was watching from the safety of the chief's hut as the monster the villagers called a wyvern was wreaking destruction throughout the town. It had come out of nowhere, bearing down upon them with terrible ferocity, and not even the bravest among had dared to stand up to it. The flying serpent had gone straight for the easiest prey, the villagers' cattle, and was gorging itself, while everyone tried to remain hidden in their homes. Valden had never seen anything quite like it. It looked a lot like the dragons in the storybooks his mother had read to him long ago. But this one seemed much more terrifying than the ones in the pictures. It had only 2 legs, but they bore vicious-looking claws, and from its head sprouted a myriad of horns. That head alone was over 15 feet long, and held aloft an endless serpentine neck, and its colossal wingspan must have been more than 200 feet. It looked quite ungainly as it stalked about the land, and it didn't breathe any fire like the storybook dragons, but it was still horrifying to behold nonetheless. Can't we do anything? Valden asked the chief, who was cowering in a far corner of the room. I mean, what if it decides to break into one of the houses? Hasn't anyone ever tried to, kill it? Of course, Grunt answered. We're not cowards, Prince Valden. I myself tried a few years ago. But even though it was smaller, I could not defeat it. I lost 2 of my best men, good friends, and the wyvern suffered not even a scratch. Its hide cannot be pierced by swords or spears or anything at all. But there must be a way. Oh, shut up, foolish boy. Oh, shut up, you foolish boy, Dara yelled, becoming exasperated with Valden's attempts to prove himself braver than them. Come back here, away from the windows, or it'll smell you. Do you want to end up like those unfortunates who thought they were heroes and ended up in the beast's belly? Yes, Valden, get back here, Nut added. There's nothing you can do, really. Yes, it'll probably kill someone, but then it'll leave. But we have to do something, the prince exclaimed. I mean, if it comes back every year, like you said, then very soon there won't be a village left. I know, lad, the chief said, his voice heavy with regret. But what can we... Hey, hold on now! Don't go! But it was too late, and Valden, in a fit of courage, or perhaps it was insanity, had climbed through the window, and he drew his sword as he stared up at the enormous wyvern. His heart nearly gave way in fear, but he couldn't bear to think of that creature devouring a helpless person, while he remained safe and sound in the biggest, strongest hut in the village. It must have a weak spot, he thought desperately. All dragons in Mother's stories did. But then, those were only stories, and they always had happy endings. The wyvern was busy scratching itself with one leg, but as soon as it was done, it turned its attention to a nearby thatched hut. With one snap of its jaws, it bit a gaping hole in the roof, and a woman's screams could be heard coming from inside. It was too much for Valden to bear, and he screamed loudly as well, hoping the thing would notice him. "Come and get me, you devil!" he shouted. "Come on! Let's see if you can face me, you big stupid worm!" With an ear-splitting snarl, the monster whipped its head in the boy's direction. Valden tried to duck for cover, but he underestimated the wyvern's speed, and he stopped in his tracks as he lashed its head out at him, its jaws snapping shut a mere couple feet where he'd been standing. He swung his sword wildly against the creature's snout, but its scales were immensely strong, and he only succeeded in blunting his blade. Then came another attack, and he dodged backwards. As he did so, he stumbled over a stone and fell on his back. Lifting his sword, he waited for another lunge. Suddenly, he heard someone cry out his name and looked back across his shoulder. There, standing with her hands pressed to her face, was his little sister. She was watching in horror, but he still felt relieved. Now that Sylvie was here, they had a real chance of defeating the wyvern. But, in his relief, he lowered his guard, and quick as a bolt of lightning, the giant wyvern's jaws descended from above and engulfed him. When the beast lifted his head, only Valden's sword remained lying on the ground. He had vanished into his mouth. Sylvie screamed as the enormous serpent spread its wings and leapt in her direction. It was on her in a second, and still screaming loudly, she fell on the ground. The wyvern sunk its claws into her back, and Sylvie scrambled this way and that, desperately trying to shake it off. Thankfully, it had only got a hold of her coat, and she managed to break free, and the beast began tearing up what it thought was its prey. Getting back to her feet, she pointed the dagger at the wyvern and waited for it to attack again. "Come and get me," she screamed, her voice barely distinguishable beneath her crying. "You may have killed my brother, but I'll make you pay. I'll kill you, you nasty piece of shit." To any of the villagers who were brave enough to sneak a glimpse outside their homes, the sight must have been an extraordinary one. 160-foot girl, screaming with rage and despair, waving a dagger the size of a small tree, throwing herself at an equally large and equally enraged monster. Sylvie swung out with all her strength, but her foe had managed to evade her and lash back with its immense tail. This it wrapped around her neck, and she sank to her knees, choking and crying in pain. The razor-sharp barbs which lined the tail tore into her skin, and she struggled to breathe. It might have ended then and there, but Sylvie thought again of how bravely Valden had fought, and she found her strength return in that brief moment. She grabbed a hold of the tail and pulled as hard as she could. The wyvern struggled, but it was not as strong as the young giantess, and she managed to grab it by its neck. "For Valden," she said, and she thrust her dagger into its chest, completely piercing its scaly hide. It roared in agony, and its tail came loose from her neck. Sylvie collapsed and gasped for breath, but had scarcely recovered when the wyvern struck again. She ducked down as fast as possible, and instead of her throat, the monster's jaws latched on the top of her head. She cried out as its teeth bit into her scalp and tried to shake it off. Eventually she managed it, but only because the wyvern itself had let go. That attack had been the last desperate strike of a dying beast. The dagger had reached its heart, and its black blood was flowing out the hole in its chest. Sylvie watched in horror as it writhed around on the ground, its wings and tail and neck flailing around erratically and knocking over at least 2 houses. At last, it gave its dying breath, and it had laid down across the snow it had stained black with its blood. Exhausted and worn out, and shattered at the thought of Valden's death, Sylvie lay down on her back and struggled to stop the tears. She massaged her aching neck and saw that her fingers were covered in blood. The pain was tremendous, but she didn't care. There was only one thing she could think about, only one image that lingered in her mind. And if it hadn't been for her, if she hadn't called out his name and distracted him, He might still be here. With her coat torn to shreds, the cold was beginning to affect her. She almost welcomed it. Maybe, she thought, it would make the pain and the sorrow go away. Maybe as it got colder and colder, she would feel less and less, until it finally got so cold that she could feel nothing at all. That would be good. Then I could see Valden again. If he ever wants to see me again. Oh, gods. I've been so horrible to him. And now I'll never get the chance to say I'm sorry. What kind of a monster I am. I'm no better than that thing over there. All I had to do was just be nice to him. Now Mother will never want to speak to me again. Or Father. Or Belina. But maybe there is one last thing I can do. Yes, I won't let Valden rot in there. I'll take him out, I'll bring him back, and then I'll go away, forever. Slowly, agonizingly, she crawled over to the wyvern's body and pulled the dagger out of its chest. There were voices coming from all around her, but they were small and faint, and she didn't want to listen. Sniffing loudly, she stuck the blade into the thing's stomach, but immediately regretted it, for the resultant smell was sickening. But she kept on carving the beast open, then rolled back her sleeve and, fighting the urge to be sick, stuck her hand into its belly. The contents of that awful place she didn't dare imagine, but she knew how big Valden's body would be, and feeling around, she found him at last. By now the revulsion she felt was too great to resist, and she threw up, though only a little bit. Several of the men of the village had dared to approach, and they watched in dumbfounded silence. None of them could recall having to see anything like what they saw today. Once she felt a little bit less nauseous, Sylvie returned to the matter of her brother. It was Valden she was holding, there could be no doubt of that. His clothes had disintegrated into slimy rags, and the wyvern's stomach juices had made his hair fall out, but the rest of him still looked almost alive. For a moment Sylvie dared to hope that there was still some life in him, but she couldn't feel his heart beating. She began to sob loudly again and held him right beneath her eyes, as if she could wish him back to life. It was then that she saw the faint, almost imperceptible wisps of frosty breath emerging from his mouth. "Oh, Valden!" she cried out, praying that she really did see what she saw. "Oh, Valden, please don't be dead. You can't be dead. You can't. I don't want you to be dead. I don't. Please. Valden, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry, Valden. For everything." Without thinking twice, she got up and began to run as fast as she could back to the mountains. Not long after she reached the marvelous pool she bathed in less than 2 hours ago, though it felt like a lifetime. She knelt down by the pool's edge and ever so carefully lowered her hands into the heated water, until Valden was completely immersed, except for his head. Then she began to wash all the blood and slime and filth off of him, as tenderly as she could. No part of his clothes remained in good condition, so she tore off part of her sleeve and wrapped his naked body in it. By now the sun was setting, and Sylvie, in no mood to build a fire or prepare for supper, sat with her back to the cliffs surrounding the hot spring. She was holding Valden gently against her breast. He was alive, she knew that, but he hadn't moved or spoke since she pulled him out of the wyvern's stomach. She knew she had to look after him, but she didn't know how, and he could very well die of starvation or the cold if she didn't take care of him properly. She began to despair, but suddenly remembered the village, and decided it might be best for them to look after her brother from now on. Though they were supposed to be helping with cleaning up the corpse of the wyvern, Rhett and Nut couldn't help but wonder what happened to Valden during the battle. Of course they had been inside when Sylvie showed up, so they didn't know what really took place, but they imagined that after killing the monster, the giant princess had taken her brother to safety somehow. Some of the other men were claiming that they saw the prince get eaten by the beast, but surely that couldn't have been true. He must have managed to escape, and perhaps he'll be back at any moment. And where was the giantess now? "Look!" Nut called out suddenly, as they were searching by the edge of the surrounding forest. "There's something coming!" It's her," Red exclaimed. "Valden's sister. Quick, we gotta go back before she sees us." But Sylvie had already heard them, and emerging from the trees, she called down to them to wait. In the shadowy twilight, her gigantic form seemed even bigger than usual. But the two boys stood their ground and wondered what she wanted. She sat down, beckoned them closer, and then lowered her hands and unfolded them, revealing a still unconscious Valden. "He's still alive," she said, before they could ask. "That dragon thing swallowed him, but I managed to save him. But he won't make it through the night. It's too cold. Could you please look after him for me? Please. I just want him to get better, but I can't do it myself." Her voice had carried over into the village itself, and more people were congregating below her. They carried burning torches and drawn swords, but once they realized why she had come, made no move to attack her. Sylvie, feeling as if she was going to cry again at any moment, managed to explain everything to the chief, and she repeated her wishes to him and his wife. The men and women were all astonished by what the giantess was telling them. They couldn't believe that the selfish child who had coerced them to feed her and threatened to stomp on them if they didn't obey had actually risked her life to protect her brother, and all of them from the wyvern's attack. It must have been the sight of her brother being taken by the monster's jaws that had changed her, but what she had done was still remarkable. She had accomplished what countless warriors throughout the centuries have failed to accomplish. And now that was all over, she was once more a child in nature. Only this time, it was she who was now pleading to them to help her. "I'm sorry for everything I did," she was saying as Valden was being carried off by some of the men in the village. "I've been really rude and unpleasant to all of you, but I won't ever again. I'll leave you alone, I promise. And I won't come back until Valden is ready to go home." That could be a while," the chief's wife Dara said. "We don't have any healers in our village, and we'll only be able to feed him and keep him warm. It could be months till he's fit again, or it could never happen at all." "That's true," the chief added. "Are you sure you want to stay, princess? We'll give you what food we can, but honestly, we don't have much for a girl as big as you. Maybe it's best that you return home." "I'm staying," Sylvie insisted. "I can find my own food, and there's a warm place up in the mountains where I can sleep. But I'm not leaving Valden alone. I don't want him to keep on hating me. I just want things between us to be all right again." Right then she did begin to cry. And Dara, her motherly instincts taking hold of her, took one of her enormous fingers and wrapped her arms around it. There. It's all right," she said. "Don't cry, Princess Sylvie. We'll look after your brother, and we'll see what we can do for you as well. You've been so brave, and I doubt any of us will ever forget what great things you've done for us today. Now come along, we'll see what we can get you to eat, unless you think you'll be able to catch anything on a dark night like this." Sylvie didn't think she would catch anything, so she carefully picked the woman up and agreed to take her back to the village. Her husband and son soon followed behind, and they all went off to find something for her to eat. In the end, they found they could only spare a few cattle, but Sylvie wasn't that hungry anyway, and 3 roasted cows satisfied her appetite. By the time she finished eating, it was very late indeed, and very cold as well, so she decided to head back to the pool. After being reassured that Valden was well looked after, and promised to return tomorrow morning to help clean up and rebuild, she headed off into the night, hoping with every step she took that everything will turn out all right in the end.